My grandfather and myself were separated for many years. I left Austria when I was 6 years old, and we really didn't connect until the 1950s and thereabouts when he was able to come back to the United States. And so I was really not very much aware of the fact that there was this big collection. I had vague recollection of the big house in Vienna and so on. And so it wasn't until my mother passed away and left me a suitcase, about this big suitcase, of his papers, which had a lot of the records of his collection and so forth. Because when they came back, they really didn't talk about the past. There was one, like so many people, they wanted that to be behind them. They looked forward. He was particularly a very forward-looking person, looked to the future and didn't dwell on the past. So it wasn't until I started going through that suitcase that I realized that the wonderful collection that he had accumulated in Vienna, and decided to see if we could maybe help bring some of that back again.
I spent a little time looking through my old files, my very big file at this point of the Richard Neumann collection, and which really mirrors the relationship I've had with Tom and his family for about 20 years now. And we first got in touch in about 2000 when I began working on a book on pre-war Viennese art collections, and I wrote to him at the time to ask about his grandfather, his family, and then I have a little bit of correspondence from when Tom sent me photographs of the house and various, interiors that of his family's residence, and that's really when we've stayed the same since then. We then embarked on trying to recover some of the works that we were finding and that we were able to document using Tom's photographs and also the historic records here in archives.
Our family history was always fascinating, not very clear. Dad, grew up in some very challenging times, and I knew something about it, but not a great detail. And I think I did know that he was very proud and influenced heavily by his grandfather, my great grandfather. And as I grew up, I think it was my freshman year of college when his mother died, and he found the suitcase, that I started to hear more about Richard Neumann. And I know that Dad has shared a lot of the very significant writings, the letters that he wrote to him as a young child, and he has some tremendous wisdom and very important lessons that influenced me from that era till today.
The Neumann case is typical in some ways and also unusual. I would say it's typical in the sense that all restitution cases take an enormous amount of time and are very, very, in many ways, tedious in finding documents of every single sort of moment in time to trace an artwork. And it's unusual in the sense that we've really spent over 2 decades now working together, and we've been lucky in that over that extended period of time, it has been possible to recover various objects from the Neumann collection over a great length. So that's wonderful. We've worked with very different institutions over the years. So I think the first institution that we approached was a provincial museum in Austria, in a little town called Krems, which is in Lower Austria. Then there was the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. Then there was, the museums in France, including the Louvre. And so these are all lessons in patience and diplomacy, and working with institutions, working with government agencies, working with institutions towards trying to reach a positive outcome and trying to actually have things returned. Tom and I have I think you and your family came to Krems, and we went together to the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and we went, we were in Paris together. So these were actual moments of trying to, being there in person. And it is a very personal process, really, for families to do this.
The situation in Krems, which is a small village just outside of Vienna, where two of the first two paintings that we got back were part of stored in the attic of the local museum, and the local mayor at first basically said, "Oh, we got them, from the Kunsthistorische, and we have a letter saying that these are ours. We gave them 500 Deutschmarks at the time, so thank you very much, but no thanks." And it was Sophie and her friends who basically managed to create a sufficiently large political let's say, effort through the local newspapers and working with the local activists to say, well, this is wrong. They really shouldn't be keeping stolen property. And eventually the mayor, who at the time just barely lost the election, finally consented to a third-party assessment by an expert who concluded that clearly these were part of the Neumann heritage and should be returned. And so they had a ceremony in the town hall at which the mayor said, I only lost the election because I did the right thing by giving these paintings back. It was a fun experience. Frank was there as well, and we had a lot of fun. But that was the first really big success, and it was sort of the point at which we decided that this was really worth pursuing. And Sophie then went back to the Kunsthistorische, where my grandfather had very close relationship with the director of the Kunsthistorische when he was alive. And we had some very nice letters which provided a lot of the grounds for the return of these paintings. Things are not straightforward by any means. They're always a little complicated. There had to be some of the paintings had been returned to my grandfather back in the 1950s, or 40s and 50s, and in exchange for keeping the very good ones in the museum. And so we had to provide for some compensation to the museum to allow us to get back the ones that were originally confiscated by the Germans.
Wouldn't you say this is unusual, that after a war, there was this big effort to get the paintings protected and not let loose where they might possibly go?
The American effort to recover art in Europe was enormous, and I think their role can't be overemphasized. And they actively sought out and recovered, I don't know, how many thousands, hundreds and thousands of objects, and did their best to document them and to return them to their original owners. So I see that very much as an effort of the Allies. Is it unusual for us to be discussing art in the context of the Nazi period? Because of course, this is not something that, it's not a direct cause of war, because most of this looting took place well before the war broke out. Most families who lost or who were stripped of their property, this happened immediately after the annexation of Austria in March 1938. So it was only 1.5 years later that war broke out. But the Nazis were incredibly invested in art. They had an unusual interest in art. I think it was on the one hand, something that they like to, how would you say, decorate themselves, or to give them sort of intellectual legitimacy. But on the other hand, there was a very concrete goal, which was to seize as much privately owned property as possible from people they had labeled as Jews, And this was directly, the intent was genocidal. It was absolutely to strip people of their personal property and to fund the Nazi genocide. And I think one of the things that's difficult and maybe different in European museums, certainly in Austrian and German museums, is that the museums that hold Nazi looted art were actually directly involved in the looting process itself. So the Kunsthistorisches Museum, the museum in Krems, these were all, they were assigned or acquired these works during the Nazi period. In the case of, curators at the Kunsthistorisches Museum or at the Albertina or at the Belvedere, all of these well-known Austrian state museums, they were a part of this process of spoliation. And so, of course, it makes their role very different from an American museum, which I think there's a general awareness today internationally that museums should look and screen their holdings to identify, things that may have been acquired under questionable circumstances. But it's different in Europe because, of course, they were part of the system. The Neumann collection, the last time that it was in one place as a collection was probably at the end of 1937, at the beginning of 1938. Once the Nazis came in, once the Nazis mandated Jews to record their property to the authorities, to give reports of everything that they own, that is when we begin to see the sale of artwork. So actually the inventory that we have, the best inventory we have of the Neumann collection, is one that was made for the purpose of filing an asset report to the authorities in mid-1938. I think most likely there were already sales before then. And then the collection is packed up. You have to, apply to get an export license. Richard Neumann was lucky because he was actually able to bring some things to France. But really, from that moment onwards, when a collection is seized or confiscated in some manner or another, that's when the collection begins to be dispersed. So usually, and in Richard Neumann's case, it actually happened twice, because in Vienna in 1938, he was required to file a report of his property. And officials came in, these are monuments officials who came in and who were able to ban the export of objects that they valued as national or could claim as national property. And those things went to museums. They were directly assigned to museums. And so they generally stayed within sort of the realm of some kind of public administration until 1945. They were recorded, they were entered into museum inventories and so forth. What happens as a sort of in a second wave often is that things become dispersed on the market, and you have private individuals who are buying these things on the private market. In Richard Neumann's case, it was unusual because he was actually able to bring those parts of his collection that had been released by the Nazis to France. And for a short time, for this respite of maybe 2 years, they lived with these things in France. After the occupation of France, you have the second wave of confiscations, of sales, forced sales to Nazi art dealers who acquire things, again, in the first instance for public institutions, for places like the so-called Führermuseum, which was a museum that Hitler planned in his chosen hometown of Linz. You have people possibly, we don't know it. I should say we don't know everything, but you have the second wave again, and then he's forced to abandon things in France that obviously and probably to sell things to to make, to cover their livelihood, to cover their flight from France, which is also an expensive um, enterprise. So but essentially what happens is with collections, they don't stay together. They don't stay in one place, but from that last moment of an inventory then becomes completely dispersed. And it usually, there are some things that go on to, into public institutions, and there's a lot that goes into sort of the tertiary market, into auction houses. That's another thing that the Nazis very consciously did, which was the forced sale at auction of so-called Jewish property, which means, and this is a problem we have throughout Europe, is that things that are acquired in a public auction, the buyers have good title to. So there's no real vehicle in order to recover things from a private owner apart from goodwill. If someone is willing to resolve the issue, and of course we don't know what is in private hands. We don't know what private individuals own, and the moment there's sort of that small moment when someone is interested in selling something and approaches an auction house, for example, to consign that work, and auction houses, at least generally speaking, and certainly the large auction houses, are all committed at this point to routinely screening in order to ensure that that they don't miss Holocaust era art. So one of the best ways is, of course, you sort of have a short window of opportunity in that moment when a private individual is interested in selling and therefore makes contact with the dealer.
Sophie's been wonderful in tracking the auction catalogs and so forth, and locating situations where the painting comes on the market. Very often the owner doesn't even know that it was part of the looted process, or looting at the time. At that point, Sotheby's has been particularly good in terms of essentially making sure their reputation is maintained properly. And they actually have a vice president, Lucian Simmons, who is charged with making sure that the restitution process, if it's appropriate, takes place. And so they have been very, when a painting is discovered, like the Madonna, for example, they've been very good about alerting us to the fact, about holding on to the painting until the settlement can be found. And then at that point, we basically involve either Sophie or a lawyer friend of hers to try to find a negotiated arrangement with them. And as you point out, as Sophie pointed out, goodwill is the most important part. But it's also a fact that once a painting has been identified as part of a looted collection, it becomes harder to sell. So the value of the painting does diminish somewhat as a result of having been discovered as part of a restitution process. So it winds up to be a negotiated process. And in the two cases that were involved, we were able to find an accommodation with the owner that was mutually satisfactory. We were very happy to have him back as part of the collection.
I should say the goodwill is on both sides, very much so. Because when you have to find a compromise, I know that you showed a lot of great goodwill and generosity in the way that you approached these individuals.
It's
Okay,
time,
can I add up?
patience, and perseverance. I guess those are the three things that you need to have,
And a little money.
and a little money.
There were two paintings, most recently that we were alerted to by Sotheby's, which is incredibly helpful and respectful in letting us know when they suspected a painting might have belonged to the Neumann collection. In terms of the deal or the negotiation, I can sympathize with the current owners who are, they're putting up for auction because they probably need the money or for whatever personal reason. And these are, generations behind, the original acquisition. And as Dad said, they may not know that it was looted. However, in the two examples we've got, we had to pay full price, effectively, what the auction house estimated the value. So we paid market value. But in terms of the value, we didn't see any significant discount or, gift. I mean, it would be a tough situation for them, I'm sure. But we were grateful that they allowed us to repurchase them before they went to the public and allowed us to bring it back together. And we're lucky as a family that we've had enough success in our careers to be able to afford to do that. So very different from the, state restituted works where, they recognized that it was, is appropriate to return it to its owner rather than sell it to us.
Well, I think one of the things that is so interesting about provenance research, and which really shows the greater relevance of it, is not only finding individual works of art, which of course is great, but there's a much bigger picture to it, because it really gives us an insight into what pre-war collecting and patronage looked like in Europe. It shows us, tells us a lot about, contemporary scholarship at the time as art historians. One of the really fascinating aspects is to see social networks, friendships, relationships. This is how many of in tracing individual works of art, these are the kinds of things that we need to find. Who did Richard Neumann buy art from? Who advised him? These are relationships of trust, of confidence. So it really shows sort of the contours of someone's life when you begin to understand better about what circles people moved in, what interested him, what made him tick, and what were his, what areas was he really enthusiastic about what he was collecting? Because I think there are many layers of it. You have on the one hand a very magnificent collection that was appropriate to his social standing, but it was obviously something that he was very passionate about. So this is interesting to reinsert that into art history when often it's been sort of eliminated. You have a generation who has not been adequately recorded in art history, or who have been forgotten or blotted out because that whole era has not been, was not able to be, to go down in history as every other generation before, because there was such a rupture.
My grandfather and I had quite a lot of correspondence, much of a philosophical nature, because he was a person who was very thoughtful about society as a whole and what things mean in the society. One of the things he said was that life is a short interval between two eternities, and the part of what you have to do is to make the most of that short interval. And I think creating a heritage for the family, a link between the present and the past, was one of the things that he really felt strongly about. And I completely agree. That's one of the things that motivated me to proceed with this whole process of restitution, of trying to restore some of the things that he really appreciated and pass that on to our kids. One of the comments, there was a wonderful ceremony in Paris when we got some of the paintings back from from his collection that had been left with the Louvre and with the French museums. And my comment at that time, I was asked to give a short talk. Comment was to say that one of the things that he felt was that art is one of the things that makes you human. That art is one of the things that basically separates humanity from other forms of life. And I think that's one of the things that we sort of begin to have to appreciate in the process, and I wanted to pass that on to our kids as well. His passion for art was such that when he was a refugee in Cuba, after leaving France and being able to escape from France, he wound up in Havana, Cuba for 8 or 9 years. And one of his contributions at that time was to be part of the formation. In fact, the most very important part of the formation of a group that created a National Gallery of Art in Havana. And his passion for art was such that he basically was able to persuade, at that time, the dictator Fulgencio Batista to build a modern art museum in Havana, which is still there. And it was a very, very successful project that he got a lot of credit for. That was his real mission in life, basically, in many ways, was to get people to appreciate art.
My great-grandfather was obviously a very special man, very important. I wish I could have met him. I get a little view into what he was like through the writings that Dad has shared with me from that suitcase. But what's exciting about the art collection is clearly art was incredibly important to him. And I can imagine him, if he were alive today, using this art collection to, share his stories and his philosophy in life, to stand in front of this collection and talk to me and my children and generations. So really it's from having just the writings to now having some art and seeing the art collection become more complete, feels like it's making a more complete picture of who my great-grandfather was. And I'm excited to continue to fill in pieces of that picture if possible, so that we have a deeper and better understanding of what he was about. How I wished he could be there to tell us the stories, but through my dad and through the writings, I think I'm getting to know him a little bit better, and I'm very excited to try to complete that picture.
That we're very, very grateful to the Worcester Art Museum for agreeing to host this collection. It's a way for honor my grandfather's interest in making sure that it was not just a family, but it was also the general public who had a chance to appreciate some of the things that he's done. And I thank you very, very much for doing that, Claire, and to the entire Worcester Art Museum staff. We really, really appreciate that.
I just want to echo, I think that's clearly one of the things I've learned about my great-grandfather is his desire to share his passion for the art with the public. And our intention from the very beginning was to try to find a way to enable that. I think he would be very proud to see the work in public, and we're grateful to the Worcester Art Museum for doing that. That's the real. It wouldn't have been right for these paintings to sit in private hands in somebody's home where nobody could see them. So we're really appreciative for Sophie for helping start the process and help us with the success, and for the Worcester Art Museum to enable them to be shared with the public, just like my great-grandfather would have liked.